Welcome to the ECE Classroom Podcast with your host, Susie Beghin, inspiring early childhood educators every day. Hello, and welcome to the ECE Classroom Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of early childhood education. I'm your host, Susie Beghin, and today we have a special guest, Christine Zupo. Christine, we're so happy to have you here today. So eager to hear from you and all of your expertise. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, first I just want to say thank you so much, Susie, for inviting me on your podcast, this amazing podcast serving so many amazing educators out there. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really also very excited to talk about this topic that I love so much. A little bit about me. I started working in the field in childcare. I guess it was 1981. It was a long, long time. So I've stopped counting the years or the decades at this point. I have gone back to school later in life and did 2 degrees. And then I started teaching at all the colleges. And now I'm full-time through Humber College and teach at University of Guelph Humber.
Oh, that's amazing. And you also have your own business as well, right?
Yes, I do workshops and conferences around topics that are meaningful to the communities that I serve. So I do design, just try and stay very current and keep my pulse on what's happening out there in the field in all the different sectors to sort of be able to go out and bring some things together and make our journey, our path so much more united.
Yeah, I'm definitely a lifelong learner, but yeah, I fully believe in lifelong learning. You never can learn enough. You never can know enough. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about bringing knowledge and experience to, other educators, maybe even just starting out in the field. So today we're going to be diving into a really interesting topic. You specialize in this topic. You deliver this sort of training called the science of happiness. Just hearing that name piqued my interest right off the start when I saw that you offer a course on this. I thought it was something I'd wanted to explore here on the podcast and share it with my listeners. So let's start at the very, very beginning. Can you tell me what is the science of happiness?
Well, the science of happiness is a branch of positive psychology, which is a branch of psychology. So if I'm talking about positive psychology, we're looking at positive psychology and traditional psychology. Traditional psychology really looks at fixing things, right? Bringing us up to a standard, right? So it looks at problems and takes care of those problems very well. And what positive psychology really does is brings us up higher to our fullest potential. So it looks at things that make us well, things that are going right in our life, right? Our strengths and our ways of connecting with people. So, how do happy people live, right? So, this started a bunch of that research, and it started really 1998. I think for centuries we've studied happiness and we've talked about happiness. Philosophers have always talked about meaning of life and happiness. When we come to the late 80s, early 90s, we start to apply brain imagery around imaging, looking at what happens to the brain when you think different things, what lights up, what are our physiological effects. And for every emotion that we do feel, there is a reaction in our body, an immediate reaction in our body, whether we're experiencing it in the present time or we're thinking about it, something that happened years and years ago. Our bodies still react to it in the same way. So that's pretty fascinating. The tenets of positive psychology, which lead into the science of happiness, look at flourishing, our sense of well-being, our personal sense of happiness, social connections, resilience, right? It's focusing on building us up to a higher level, reaching that self-actualization.
And, happiness definitely is, something that we all want to achieve, right, in our lives.
Yeah.
I think that's, purpose of life a lot of times is people just, trying to find happiness in different ways.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about how this relates to the field of early childhood education and how you bring it into the world of early childhood educators.
Okay, so this is what I find very fascinating about the science of happiness. So the sustainable happiness model came out in the early 2000s from Berkeley Institute. Berkeley University. And that really looked at our genetics, looked at what control we have and life experience. So let me ask you a question right now, and you don't have to tell me the answer to this. You shouldn't tell me the answer to this because you're not
Okay.
supposed to. What would you wish for right now that would bring you the most happiness, right? So you got that. In my mind, it's always winning the lottery. I feel like, yay, that would do it for me. So what this sustainable happiness model shows us is that we all have this baseline of happiness, right? We have a baseline. This is part of our personality. It's part of what we've developed over the years. So if I do win the lottery or you do get your wish, your emotions are going to go way up, right? It's going to be like, yay, I just won $70 million. My emotions are really high. But what is going to happen in about a year, 18 months, or, something around that is I'm going to come back down to my baseline, right? So wherever I was, I'm going to get used to that. So it's going to come down. The same sort of thing is going to happen if I lose everything and I have a devastating experience in life. I am going to go down in my emotions. And then after a while, I will go back to my baseline. So here we have our baseline, and it's important for us to understand that baseline, that there is a baseline first, because what positive psychology and science of happiness is wants us to understand is to live in ways that are intentional so that we can always be experiencing positive emotions on a regular basis, just integrating it into our life regularly so that we're always living above that baseline. And after time, we do change the neural connections in our brain when we're really dedicated and committed to making those changes. So it's really so the sustainable happiness model will tell us that we have a good 40% of control over our thinking and our actions. That's pretty huge,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's really huge. And that is the part that really excited me. So we have this huge amount of control over what we think and what we do. And, it's important for us to know that if I'm here thinking about maybe a not so great experience that happened a few years ago, my brain doesn't know it's, 2018. It's just reliving those emotions, and I'm still having a negative physiological effect. But if I start to think about those positive things that happened, and I'm creating positive experiences in my daily life, and I think about those, I'm still going to have a physiological reaction, but it's going to strengthen me, right? It's going to strengthen my immune system. It's going to lower blood pressure. It's going to change the shape of my brain. It's going to do all good things for me. And we, in fact, then create our subjective sense of happiness and a sense of wellness. It's not to say that positive psychology or the science of happiness is the fix for everything, because it's not. It's a layer, right? It's an intention. There are necessary times when we do need supports to understand experiences we may have experienced in life. So it doesn't take away from traditional psychology. It sort of layers on top of that. So they work together.
So can you tell me a little bit more about the research behind this? Just think 100 years ago, obviously we didn't have the kind of technology we have now to measure brain activity and things like that.
Right,
So
right.
so this is fairly new, but what's the research behind it? Tell me a little bit about that.
The research, right? So when we're looking at that, we see the birth, as you were mentioning, the birth of cognitive neuroscience beginning in the late 80s, early 90s, right? And so this technique of brain imaging came into effect. So it started to look at different parts of the brain region. I think it's the right prefrontal cortex that lights up when you are thinking these positive or experiencing positive emotions. But along with that, there's a physiological effect. There's a release. There's a release of these what's called happy brain chemicals. And the four happy brain chemicals are what we really want to understand. And it shows that we can release them ourselves through
Yeah, so
our
tell me
own
how.
thoughts. Yeah. Okay.
Tell me
So
more about that.
like we don't have to wait. Like we don't have to wait for good, happy things to happen. We can go create them. So it all comes down to, at the heart of this, is positive emotions, experiencing positive emotions. So we don't have to wait for a positive emotion to happen. We can go and experience. So all the research that stemmed after this was looking at what happens to us when we go out and do these kinds of positive interventions. For example, we've all heard of acts of kindness, right? We've all heard
Hmm.
of gratitude, joy, living in awe, right? Going in nature and being in awe, right? Finding something in nature that's just like, wow, this is really beautiful. But doing this intentionally, so that when I'm looking at this beautiful, large, beautiful tree, I am savoring that moment. I'm pausing that moment. And it's kind of like what we need to do is pretend we have sort of like a little dial, and that we hold that feeling and we turn it up. We intensify the feeling. And when we do that, we start to release all those positive neurotransmitters. It's like a toolkit, right? It's like nature's toolkit: dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins. These are like nature's toolkit that we have 40% control over. So we're not chasing happiness. We're creating positive emotions. These positive emotions build up and create resilience, right? Create
That's
different ways of thinking.
that's such a different mindset. I mean, I feel like most people, myself included,
Mhm.
you wait for things to happen to make you happy, right? Or you try to do things to make yourself happy, or you're kind of in this holding pattern for happiness to happen to you.
Yes.
Um, but it's nice to know that there's a way that you can do, lift up your own emotions, and it can lead to, I think, a better quality of life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the part that I really enjoy talking about this and figuring this out. Is it's for children, but it's not just for children. It's also for educators, it's for families, it's for us, right? To sort of recognize the control we have. So there are lists, there's a lot of research on positive interventions. So things like right now, for example, if you just stopped for a moment and think about three good things in your life. So let's just try that. Think about three good things in your life, right? And what they are. And then while you're thinking about it, turn up that dial. Turn up the intensity of that emotion and hold it for about 10 seconds. So that what you're doing is you're really savoring those three good things in your life. And when you do that for yourself, you are releasing things like serotonin and dopamine and all these, really oxytocin, depending on what you're thinking about. You're releasing these, nature's toolkit for our well-being. And I think
That's
it's
beautiful.
really, yeah, it's really beautiful. And there's so many positive interventions, right? Writing a gratitude letter, for example. So thinking about somebody that's really important in your life, that's done something for you, and they mean so much to you, but maybe they don't really know, or maybe they do. And so you write a letter out to them, but you don't just write a letter out. You pour your heart into that letter. You make it soppy, right? You mushy, and you write that letter, and then you go and read it to them. So this intervention has shown to raise your happiness 25% above your baseline and hold it there for about 6 months.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I always knew gratitude was powerful, but you're kind of putting a different perspective on it now in terms of gratitude and happiness, and the connection there. And these are great practical strategies. Anybody can be grateful for even the smallest thing.
Mhm.
It's just a matter of changing your mindset, and looking at things differently. What do you feel about joy versus happiness? I've heard the distinction between those two things, where happiness is something that's kind of fleeting, whereas
Mm,
joy is something a little bit more long term. Does
mhm,
that
mm.
fit into this discussion of the science of happiness?
I think it does in a way, because happiness, if we're chasing happiness, it is fleeting, right? It is fleeting. Because what happens when you get to the part that you're chasing, right? As students,
Yeah.
they want to graduate and they want the best marks, but
Right.
then you get it and then what, right?
It's always
So,
then what? Yeah.
right. And I think that's why this is called the sustainable happiness model, so that you can sustain happiness through your daily life, right? So living in awe, living in gratitude, making connections with others. There's another wonderful intervention. It's called make 3 loving connections. So during your day, make 3 loving connections with your colleagues, with the children, with the families. And that would mean that you're present, you're listening, right? You're being empathetic, and you're really engaged in that moment. So it's intentional. Some of us do it naturally, and that's good, but let's add some intention to that as well too. And turn
Right.
up that dial and hold those positive emotions, at least for
Yeah.
10 seconds. Yeah.
I love the intentionality of this approach. And that's how I guess, where the control comes in, where you have that 40% control is where you have intention to be grateful, because we can be, grateful in our regular day, but to be intention to be grateful, to be intentional about making connections, to be
Mhm.
intentional about seeing the world in a different way, looking with the eyes of a child, I always say,
Yeah.
seeing things new, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I feel like, yeah, that's really the key here is to have intent with your actions.
That is really key, right? And that's the sustainable part of it. So that 40% is our control and actions, around 40%. We're not going to cut it extremely at that. Whatever you wished for, whatever I wished for on my lottery, is really shown to only be about 10%. It's like, I can't imagine that, but so it leaves that other 50%, right? And this is the part that I find really connects to working with young children. So as adults, we've already established our baseline, but children haven't, right? It's
Mm,
their early experiences that are establishing their baseline. So we really want to think about that. We want to really think about how we are helping children to develop that baseline of happiness that they're going to carry with them for their life, right?
right. Hmm.
Temperament, I think, really comes into that. So, if there's a child with a more challenging temperament, this is DNA. You can't change that temperament. You can't make that challenging temperament change any more than you could change the size of their nose, right? So, but the damage we could do is try and punish that or redirect that or make it hard on the child or label the child for having that temperament,
Hmm.
because that child's going to take that internally. That's going to
Right.
become part of their self-concept of how they see themselves, right? Through the messages they hear, the actions, things that are said and things that aren't said, right?
Right. This is
And
huge.
this is
Yeah.
huge.
This is huge. Like, we are, as educators, are influencing this baseline for
Yeah,
these young little ones that we interact with on a daily basis, whether
yeah,
they're our own children or as educators. Like,
yeah,
it's amazing.
yeah,
That's one of the reasons I went into this field, is I knew that, as early childhood educators, we can influence young children's trajectory and where they go in life, and what they end up doing, and
right,
how they end up being, right?
right.
And this just, further adds to that argument that there is so much influence that an educator has on a young child.
It's huge. Now, if that same educator set that child up to experience goodness for himself, reward in the sense that I can do it. I know what calm feels like. I hear positive messages about myself. That's going to be internalized, right?
Right.
So we have to really kind of think about all these, things that we know about and relate it to what we understand as well too about this whole idea of creating that baseline. And for someone who's going to walk the face of the earth for the next 75, 80 years or longer, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little bit overwhelming, I have to admit,
Yeah.
that we have this much influence, but yeah, it's huge.
Yes.
So, for educators that come to your courses,
Mhm.
and this one in particular, what would you say is probably one of their biggest aha moments that they would get out of this Science of Happiness course? Like, what is their biggest takeaway from this?
Their biggest takeaway that I usually find is the amount of control that they have. So one of the assignments is they have to do a little pre-test on themselves to see their baseline of happiness. Then they go out and they implement for over 4 weeks all these different interventions that have been lifted out of science articles that have been shown to increase levels of well-being and happiness. And they get to choose which ones they want, so it fits their personality. Because maybe if you're an introvert, you don't want to go out and do 5 acts of kindness right away. Maybe you have to build up to that. So they work on this, and then they do a post-test, and their numbers have always increased. And so then they have to write some reflections, and the reflections are really deep in the sense that how not only do they see the world a little differently, but they also see themselves differently, right? So it's really very impacting and very powerful. So I think it's the amount of control, to answer your question, that they see, and that they can go out and live a different life. And I notice when I teach this class, there's a different sort of bond that's created with students. And so it's really interesting,
That's
for sure.
fascinating. Yeah, I'm fascinated with the topic for sure. So tell me, how do positive emotions affect us, like at a physical level?
So at a physical level, there's a lot of things that are happening. So I just want to go through a little bit about these neurotransmitters first. I just want to talk a little bit about dopamine. So dopamine is our motivation chemical, right? And it's our reward chemical, right? It helps us to experience success. We release it when we experience success. So
Mm-hmm.
for us as educators, we want to always be commenting and affirming children's strengths, acknowledging the efforts that they make, not because it's an appropriate behavior guidance strategy, but because you are igniting children's happy neurotransmitters. And we know that. And we know that is shaping up the brain and creating that good baseline. And there's serotonin, which is the mood stabilizer. That comes out when we're connecting to calm, to relationships, feelings of safety, gratitude. So we want to help children express their feelings, right? We want to acknowledge their feelings. We don't want to really say things like put your tears in your pocket.
Yeah, I don't like
I've seen a
that.
child try to actually do that once. Those types of things, taking their emotions really serious, like especially with a slow to warm up child, they might have one little tear, but that one little tear is packed with huge emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to disregard that. We want to talk about that and make sure that their rights are met, that
Mm-hmm.
fairness is there, not just to ignore them because they're not making the big fuss like maybe
Mm-hmm.
a more challenging temperament would. Then there is oxytocin. This is the bonding, right? This is the love hormone. You can cuddle with your cat or your dog, or enjoy a nice relationship with the children. All those types, those social connections
Yeah,
release
like giving
oxytocin.
hugs.
Giving
Yeah,
hugs.
I know, and in some daycares are not allowed to give
I
hugs.
know.
And that's a big
Yeah.
oxytocin releaser, right? The
Yeah.
hugs. And so, yeah, like happiness just from giving a hug. Wow.
Right. And from smiling too, right?
Yeah.
All these. So we have to really be aware and intentional. Also, to positive words that we use. We speak on average 16,000 words a day. So if we have that, that's very powerful, right? That's a very powerful tool. It's the words that we use.
Yeah.
So, using positive words, recognizing positive actions children are engaged in, not just the negative, and
Right.
saying, look at what you did, right? You remember to put that Kleenex in the garbage, right? Those kinds of things. It's kind of like, you give them a hit. And then there are endorphins. So things like movement, laughter, right? Laughing releases endorphins. So let's bring our humor to work with us, right? Let's just keep moving. Our bodies are really magical, right? It's like we have this whole pharmacy in our bodies that will help us to be well when we figure out how to really master them.
Right. It's like
Yeah.
tapping into those secrets, that will release all those happy chemicals.
Yeah, exactly. Some chemical is going to be released. Let's look at it that way. Every emotion is going to release a chemical. So we can't help that life is also very negative and hard sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
What we want to do is have a good balance. So even the research talks about if we're experiencing something negative, go out and create at least 3 positive emotions to balance that out
Mm-hmm.
so that we can bring our control into our lives, our autonomy into our lives, and help children. This is one that we can do with children. we can do with ourselves at any time. So if you place your hand on your heart,
Okay.
right, just sit quietly, breathe a little bit, try and see if you can either feel the heartbeat in your hand or through your chest. And just like taking a deep breath. And another one. Right, so we do that about 3 or 4 times. You know what just happened to your brain? Your brain just lit up like you were getting a real hug. And that's pretty awesome.
Yes.
This is something, when we're trying to get children's attention, or we don't have to do hands on head. We can do hands on heart, those kinds of things. And we can always be giving ourselves a hug when we need it. And we can also help children learn how to give themselves a hug as well, too.
Love that. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So we're going to end off on that note. Before we end off, though, let our listeners know how they can reach out to you.
I sent to you that maybe we can post. So
Okay.
they on that link, there's my email address and a list of workshops that I hold. This is one of my favorite. And if I do a workshop in your community, I also will send you off with a challenge for you to increase your level of happiness, your subjective sense of happiness and well-being.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
Lovely.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for being here today. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm going to definitely be more intentional to release those happy hormones and get my baseline up.
Thank you so much for having me. Take good care.
Hello, and welcome back. Today's episode with Christine on the science of happiness was definitely a learning experience for me. I learned a lot about all the different happy brain chemicals. I know I had heard of those different chemicals before, but I like how she explained how each one has a different physical impact on us. And what I especially appreciated was how it connects to the field of early childhood education, not just ourselves as educators, but how we are influencing children to form that baseline of happiness and to influence their experience of happiness just in our regular day-to-day interactions with them. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. It's definitely overwhelming to think that you have that much influence over a child. But at the same time, it's also wonderful that you have that much influence over a child and that you can impact their experience of happiness in this world that they're going to carry forward for years and years to come. So that was my big takeaway from today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope that you too can bring happiness into your own life through intentional actions or ways that we talked about today. Even if it's just as simple as giving yourself a hug or thinking of, something that you love, or even just being grateful for today. And I hope that you can also bring happiness into the lives of the children you serve. Thanks for tuning in to the ECE Classroom with Susie Beghin. For more information, you can visit our website at www.susiebeghin.com. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast so you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. Thanks for listening.